Welcome back to another episode of Making a Difference in Mental Health. I'm your host, Danielle Young.
I'm your co-host, Wendy Greer.
Yes, and we're back today for part 2 of the conversation about the impact of Roe v. Wade from the lens of mental health. And today we have our friend to the show and colleague, Mr. Marty Caldwell. Marty, welcome back.
Hi, Marty. Good to see you.
Good to be back.
So you remember when you and I were talking last week with Valerie, our coworker, and we were talking about some really important issues around Roe v. Wade, and we were kind of wondering, well, what does a man think? What does a male clinician think? And would it be great to have that discussion? Yeah. So we welcome Marty. Marty's bold and brave again to come on and give his perspective from a male point of view about how Roe v. Wade is impacting everyone. And so, Marty, to kick it off, what are you seeing in your personal practice with clients? How is it impacting? I'm curious, any men? Have you come across any discussion with any of the young male clients that you have on your caseload?
To be honest, no. It has not come up with any young men or any older men in my caseload. It has come up in the group therapies we started recently with some of the young women. I run the group around age 18 to 21, and some of those clients have, just acknowledged that, the rules have changed for them, and that, they little bit of a shock factor for them in terms of like what this means for them going forward.
Okay. Are they expressing, initial shock? Are they expressing, future worry, wondering about coping? I think it's more speaks to maybe not necessarily anybody in your group who is pregnant right now, but what does that mean for them in terms of a bigger perspective, their bodies and having control and all of that? Did you get into any of that discussion?
Yes, so the control aspect is, I think, the one that most women are going to be impacted by, which is, like we had options, those were taken away from us in case something were to happen, whether it be for physical health, whether it be, because I can't take care of this child that I have, and, and a lot of the things I see, and this was, in my case, there's a lot of women with children that were not planned or were not wanted. And fair to say, there's a lot of struggle because, that's a lot of both mental and physical resources being poured into all these children. And so the young women in my group have basically said, like, it's a bit concerning that, this is a choice that has, been taken from us. Maybe not in the state of Maryland so much, but perhaps if they were to move or something like that. However, they did seem, and I'm already going to go with the silver lining to this, they seemed optimistic in terms of like, hey, we're young, we're the upcoming age group, we can make a difference.
Right.
Yeah, it was cool. It was really cool to hear them say that.
Right. I've been hearing that. I'm hoping that, right? I think this generation coming up, what is it, Generation Z? I think we're on
so.
Z.
We've had that conversation with the different generations. And
Generation Z, that generation's not having it. It's all about authenticity, enough of what baby boomers created and Gen X people created. It's more like we're here now and we're gonna try to fix this because you put this on our backs, so to speak. But very interesting that it's coming out. People are like expressing their concern. And I think you made a good point. It goes back to our first podcast discussion that we had with Valerie about, we were trying to talk about myths. And I remember I spoke about in the 90s, a lot of my female clients were having children. There was nobody jumping around to abort any of their pregnancies because there were so many other options in terms of birth control. And here you are in the 2000s, late 2000s, talking about your clients who, although they didn't want the child, they did, they still didn't go through with, having abortions, and they had the children anyway. And although it is a struggle for them, so that kind of dispels that myth that it's just used so widely and recklessly. So I always like to try to pound that home.
You know, I think the conversation is interesting too, because yes, it impacts women the most, but I don't want us to solely focus or, you know, shine the light only on women. This impacts men too. As I said in the last podcast, this to me is a very private issue. And I think we talked about this offline too. For me, it's also a generational thing where this generation now is very open. And Marty, you just mentioned something about the optimism of creating change. You know, there's some lawmakers, you know, in your group or voters in your group that are going to make change. I did see a meme that said, this generation is a generation that's not going to make their kid do something or make their child, you know, necessarily follow the staunch rules. They have the ability to think freely and kind of be free, you know, not reckless abandon, but be free in their thought process. And so maybe there are some change makers in your group and for listeners. But I'm going to say what I said in the last podcast too, since this is really focused on men and, you know, from a mental health perspective, but we're looking in that lens today. Like, what is the male thought process? Also, you know, name a law or rule about the male reproductive system.
Right.
And then also look at who is making the law.
Exactly.
You know, the majority are men and majority are white males. And we have a white male on our platform today discussing, you know, this very topic. It's uncomfortable sometimes to talk about. I come from a generation where even talking about the subjects of assault even or, you know, pregnancies that didn't go well because of medical issues. It was something that was quiet. It's something that is private, and it's something that you're allowed to grieve or allowed to process without the world
knowing your business. Exactly.
And, you know, Marty, we've also talked about even some of our clients. I'm not sure if you have them, but I think you did mention it, but clients who have experienced pregnancy due to assault, or sometimes it's unwanted. Even those things we wouldn't put on blast. That's a private group of people who are connecting, who have similar experiences or at least can empathize with their fellow group member. But because of this particular ruling, things like this become public. And so that's why I say, okay, well, if it becomes public, we really need for men or to hear the male voice too. I mean, we're women. you're hearing us.
Right.
But the male voice is just as important. But also, and I'm just gonna say this, and I'll toss it over to you, Wendy or Marty. There was a video, I didn't see it, but a family member of mine saw it, and Wendy, I think you saw it as well, about a man being impacted with the rule, but it sounds like he wasn't for it because it would prevent him from
paying.
Right. And this is an example of the abuse, right? The misuse of services when there comes to pregnancies that are unwanted. That's the example of misuse. But to me, he becomes the poster of the reason why this was overturned.
Right.
It's because the myth is that it's used as a form of birth control when there are so many other factors. And I'll say this last thing. Valerie even explained, working in a clinic, she said, if you only knew what happened in the four walls, if you only knew the conversations, if you only knew the emotions, the struggles behind these decisions that are made, you'd have a completely different view, possibly, of this entire topic.
Exactly. So yes, that meme, or not a meme.
I think it was a video. I still haven't seen it to date, but I was impacted.
I don't know if I saw it, but you know, just for our audience members, this man was very upset that it got overturned because he was like, what am I going to do when my next girlfriend, gets pregnant? And so yes, it is an example of being misused, abuse of the choice. And I still contend that many women today don't look for that. I think, you know, given where we are in our country, there's a lot of medical reasons that women have to choose that path in terms of their own well-being and health. But Marty, as a male therapist, okay, so you haven't really come across too much with young men in your practice or in your caseload, but have you given it thought? Like, what would you do if that was presented to you? How would you, you know, handle a conversation with one of your young male clients?
I have thought about that, and the reason I've thought about that is because I have a couple younger men, you know, like maybe they're in their late teens or early mid 20s, and one thing that comes up is that they enjoy unprotected sex. And the reason, you know, and we all know that carries a significantly higher risk for pregnancy. And honestly, sometimes I'm amazed that like they've gone this far without that coming up.
Yes.
Right.
So that like, and I'm there's plenty of other methods we don't need to get into here about that.
Right.
But you know, that is, you know, that's a conversation that I've thought about. Like this could come up literally any second.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
I got this woman pregnant. I don't want a child right now. Neither does she, or maybe she does. I don't know. What do I do? So there's a couple ways to approach this. One would be like the preemptive measure is like, you know, our job as therapists is we're kind of like detectives in a way. We kind of like call out, or almost like detective and lawyers. We have so many different hats at once. Or we, you know, we hear that behavior like, well, wait a minute, you know, like you're engaging in this riskier sexual behavior. Like, have you thought about the consequences? And generally speaking, the answer is no, they haven't thought about the consequences. Or if they have, they've kind of like brushed it off, like, oh, that's not going to happen. And it's like, and if it does, what are you going to do? So you can catch that preemptively, which would, you know, I think every therapist kind of has that. You know, we're all kind of like ready to go at like the drop of like any ounce of information. This is a perfect example of a time to do that.
Right.
If it comes after the fact, then, you know, our job would be to process like what is our young man or older male client going through, or anyone who can, you know, provide that part of the birth process. You know, could be anyone at this point. So then we would just ask like, well, like, what are some of your thoughts about this? You know, just the general exploring feelings and process whatever anxiety they have. Because at that point, you know, the deed is done. There's
Right.
now there's this question, but the issue they face is now one of their options is gone. And now, and then Wendy and I were talking about this earlier today, is that now there's a good chance that, you know, if they decide to have the child, they may not be able to take care of it. Child enters the foster care system, which we know is woefully unequipped right now.
That.
Yep, and the other factor is like, what does this happen to? Disproportionately happens to people of color.
Yes.
Another thing we talked about, you know, you go out and you work with clients in the system, you're going to see that pretty much right away. And then you have to deal with that other layer, which, you know, something that I don't have to worry about as a white male is these personally. But then you see all my clients are majority people of color, and then you see they might ask like, well, like, what am I going to do with this child? Can I wind up with a relative? And the answer is like, statistically speaking, no, that's not going to happen. So, you know, it's all these different layers that, you know, that a regular client isn't going to think about because they probably haven't had the same experience that we do.
Right.
So, you know, there's just a big psychoeducation piece that I think a lot of people could make that could potentially help their decision making.
Right. And Marty, you're actually touching on a lot of things that we talked about with Valerie, including the psychoeducation piece, also like the disproportion, at least the statistics that are shown for people of color. But I do also believe that some statistics show that the majority of persons prior to this who have received abortions aren't, you know, Black people or the welfare queen or whatever was said in the late 80s and early 90s. I believe the statistics show that it's actually white women.
And maybe women, wealthy white women, women of means that can go somewhere, even out of the United States, and have that procedure done in quiet, in privacy, in silence and no one ever finding out too.
And that touches on the socioeconomic part where the resources might not be there if that is a decision that a person of color, a female person of color, a woman would like to make or even consider. But I think, again, going back to the psychoeducation, I think women, we are always given more information. I feel, this is just my own theory. Just go with me for a second.
Preach, Danielle.
So from time to time, I'll tell my clients this. So especially my male clients and even some of my male friends, right? As when you're born, and from my generation, when you're born and you're a girl, you get a little blanket, and maybe the first thing that you get as a toy is a doll baby. So from like 2, 3, 4, you have a doll baby. You might get a tea set, or like a little kitchenette set with a stroller, a table, a apron. You're learning already how to multitask in these gender roles that are usually assigned to girls, right? And not only that, when I was 8, my mother gave me my first checkbook. She used to be a banker. So she gave me a checkbook that was already used, but I thought I was doing something. But by 8 years old, I'm pretending to balance out my finances. And then after that, you're learning how to multitask, clean your room, do your homework, study, participate in, extracurricular activities. By 18, I was in a relationship, and I just knew I was going to marry him. So I'm also planning my wedding. But what the point is, all along the way, from the time that we're born as young girls to young, femalehood to womanhood, we've been trained, we've been taught, we've been educated on certain things, specifically either about our bodies, about our careers, about things that we're supposed to do, right? So I painted the picture. With boys, and this happened with my brothers too, they're born, you get a truck or some boy toy, and or designated supposedly for the gender norms of this is a boy toy, and or GI Joe or whatever the action figures are, and then you're metaphorically told, okay, go outside and play. So you play your sports, but that's really about it. And then by 18, you're told, okay, now you're a man. Go be a man.
Right.
But all the time between, let's just say 4 to that 17 or 18 years old, I don't know what happens in the male world, but I've seen it, with my brothers, that it takes a little bit longer for some young men to understand, to adapt, to educate themselves on things of the world outside of, sports or just going to work.
Right.
So when it comes to family, when it comes to these sensitive issues, and Marty, you've already talked about it, where young men, you don't know how they've gotten this far without getting someone pregnant, but those conversations happened. Right. As a young lady, I was told, from a religious space too, there's certain things that you don't do with a young man. You don't do this. It was almost like a secret club of this is the way that you conduct your life. And if a young man comes into the orbit, this is the way you can conduct your life. But a lot of times from the young men that I have sessions with, there's an element of that missing. So now we're having a conversation about Roe v. Wade, and I don't know, especially from the male clients that I have, if they're even aware or in the orbit of understanding or thinking about the impact of this. So I said that long, drawn-out metaphoric story to show that there's so much weight put on a woman. So if there's weight put on me to make certain decisions all along the way about my body and whom I'm with, then why can't I make the certain decisions about my body when certain things happen to me?
Right.
But also, we need to educate more men, young males to men, about also what happens with their bodies and also what can happen, to them mentally as well when these topics such as Roe v. Wade come up.
Right. Now, I also heard, I think I mentioned it to you, Danielle, just in passing on the news, how older men are starting to take charge and starting to, go for vasectomies and, all these things to help offset pregnancies. And I think I think what I gathered when I heard it from a space of, I don't want a woman to have to go through that decision.
I
I don't
hope
want
that's
to.
the space.
Yeah, I'm hoping that's the space. Well, I think it's a space because what I know is most men don't want to do that anyway. They don't have to. But coming from the space of, yeah, I don't want to see my my female partner or my female friend or my sister or my, whatever female relative have to go through that. So we'll see. It could be a trend.
I mean, Marty, what are your thoughts? Again, I've not lived the male experience, I've not lived a white male experience. But what I do know is that from a very young age, being reared, I've been educated in a lot of areas of my life, from professional to personal to even this. What are your thoughts or, your perspective?
So, I mean, I'm going to speak generally and from just observation here because I don't have like hard evidence, but I'd say generally, of course, it's up to the family. More often than not, there's still to this day in 2022 a boys will be boys mentality. I am starting to see a shift where, like if a boy does something he's not supposed to, like, he harasses, another student, boy or girl or whoever at school, anyone of any gender, the parents are starting to be like, you really can't do that because there's severe consequences for you.
Right.
Which, like that's debatable about how you can approach that. It's like, it's for consequences for you, not like how does this make the other person feel?
So that's what I mean, Marty, where a little boy may do something and like say he's 7. Well, you can't do that. Well, why not? I wasn't taught about that particular thing. Whereas as girl, I'll just speak again for myself. And this is a lot of disclosure, but I feel like some of our listeners can relate that I was told from a very young age how you should treat a person.
Right.
Before you even go into the school, ladies, you're demure, you're proper, you're nice, you're friendly, you don't hit
your thank yous. Yes.
Please and thank you. You don't hit, you don't, So that's the thing where it does become a challenge of when is that taught? The whole boys will be boys to me is an excuse.
Right.
But at the same time.
But I think because of where we are with this, that I think maybe it's a reckoning on families. It's a reckoning on parents now looking at it from a different lens. Like, oh, this is serious. If I'm raising a son, I'm going to have these conversations. I'm going to have to, prepare, my child and if I have a daughter too, but I'm really going to have to maybe rethink the rearing practices of young boys. Because this is so serious because it involves potentially another life.
Yeah.
So.
Ooh, yeah. I can feel myself getting.
I know it's a tough.
It's a very passionate topic. To me, private. That's made public, but still very passionate.
Right. And I want to really acknowledge that it is. I'm saddened in a sense that we have to have such a public conversation about something that should be so private and remain that way. But we would be remiss as clinicians if we did not start talking about this and not start trying to give, our colleagues tips and advice and, because you're going to get that client that's going to come in like you, Marty. The young girls were, starting to kind of express, their feelings about Roe. And then, eventually you talk to your male client who was like, yeah, I've been out there having unprotected sex and, I'm good, but you and I know your number is going to come up and you're not going to be so good, but it's preemptive, as you said. It's a lot of psychoed. Let's start, really informing kind of, you think your clients know that are young and teenagers, but, teenagers are impulsive and, free and young, and they don't think about it until after the incident happens. But I think as clinicians, a lot more psychoeducation because choices have been taken away. And so you've got to be smarter about how you deal with things. So that's how I see it.
So Marty, before we wrap up, is there, for our clinicians, right, for our colleagues, is there something that you would want to encourage or empower the listeners on, not just our clients, but again, our colleagues,
Mm-hmm.
on, how we approach this with clients, as we continue to move throughout this impactful phenomena that's happening right now.
I think, and this is going to be similar to what I said on the last time I was on, was just like, be aware of the gaps where people don't have the information, or maybe areas that, especially if there's any other male clinicians, other perspectives or sides that you haven't considered, have that conversation. Be aware, if a client is engaging in risky behavior, like we just talked about, or like any risky behavior, because we screened that in evaluation, that's something to address, express concern over, and maybe there's a time to plant a seed of better decision making for the client,
Mm-hmm.
and then they can make those choices themselves with a little more information than when they started.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially this, for male clients, because that, like we were just saying, male presenting clients who can have the potential to impregnate others. They may not have this decision making. They might not have the information to make the right decision, which we just said, thanks to socialization. So we can make that difference in what these clients are choosing.
Mm-hmm. I really like that.
Yep.
I really like that. Any last thoughts before we go?
It's just, it's a tough subject. And again, I'll just reiterate the importance of these conversations, clinicians, and hopefully somebody in the audience hears something, a colleague gets a little snippet and says,
Mm-hmm.
hey, I'm going to try to use that when I'm in session, or hey, I'm going to be prepared because
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if my female clients or my male clients are going to approach me with this, but I'm going to be ready. And I think we just have to be ready.
Mm-hmm.
Void of what your personal decision is, our view on it,
Right.
we have to be ready.
Right.
We're here for the client, so we have to be ready.
Right. So I like that. Psychoeducation and just being ready and being prepared to have the discussion, to have the conversation. And then as a clinician, helping us guide our clients through certain decisions that they make, as Marty has said. So Marty, we thank you so much for joining us, being a friend to the show. And I think this is your second time coming on, and we might have you on again. We certainly appreciate you and your time. And even from your perspective, Marty, you add such a good perspective and the male voice, because we've been needing a male voice.
Right. So hopefully you're encouraging other male colleagues to come on and chit chat.
Come on, guys.
Danielle and me about anything. It doesn't even have to be this topic, but just come tell us about
Marty
something.
said, come with it. Come on.
The water's fine.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yes. So we appreciate you, Marty, as always, and thank you for coming on.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Danielle Young.
I'm Wendy Greer.
This is Making a Difference in Mental Health, where we're always striving to make a difference in mental health. We'll see you next time.
Take care. Be safe.
Bye.